Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive right into the core of human subjectivity and self-deception. We're unpacking a really big question today. Why does truth always seem to remain so elusive? To do this, we'll be looking through the lens of the brilliant documentary films of Errol Morris. You see, Morris has spent his entire career examining how people construct their own realities, just to cope with their vulnerabilities, and how our internal narratives constantly obscure objective facts. It's a wildly fascinating journey into the human mind, so let's jump right in. So, can we ever actually capture objective truth? To even begin exploring that profound philosophical question, we've got to start with the physical search for truth, and a very unique device that was designed to capture it. When you think of a typical documentary interview, you're probably picturing a classic Mike Wallace or Larry King setup, right? The subject is looking off to the side, talking to an interviewer who's sitting just out of frame. But Morris felt that this traditional setup turned the audience into a mere fly on the wall, and that we were losing a really crucial element of human connection. He wanted to entirely strip away that distance. Enter the inner Rotron. The name itself is actually a mashup of the words terror and interview, which is pretty fitting. It simulates direct eye contact, attempting to bypass those distanced interviews to relentlessly pursue unmediated truth. By using a clever system of two-way mirrors, the subject looks directly into the camera lens, but they actually see Morris's face projecting right back at them. It literally forces the viewer to engage face-to-face with the subject. This creates an intense, first-person confession that draws us right into their inner world. Section 1. Why Truth Remains Elusive. The Barrier of Subjectivity. Now, you'd think that getting face-to-face would solve everything, right? Well, despite the interoptron bringing us closer than ever, we quickly hit a massive hurdle. Objective reality is still heavily obscured by our own internal narratives. Morris firmly believes that a real historical world exists completely independent of us. But, and here's the catch, that reality is almost always unknowable because we're totally trapped within our own subjective lenses. The camera can ultimately only capture what the subject believes, and what they believe is often a meticulously crafted shield. Section 2. Memory, Media, and Murder, Fractured Perspectives in Dallas. Let's look at the 1988 film The Thin Blue Line, which is famous for actually helping overturn a wrongful murder conviction by exposing the flawed fantasies constructed by witnesses. This film brilliantly juxtaposes the cold, hard reality of a murder against these highly subjective narratives. Take one key witness, Emily Miller. She was deeply enchanted by classic police dramas like Boston Blackie and desperately wanted to be a detective herself. The film strongly implies that her participation in this heroic, fictional justice narrative was vastly more important to her than the objective reality of who actually killed the police officer. What's amazing is that Morris never actually shows us the real murder. Instead, he shoots the false testimonies and the high-contrast, moody lighting of a 1940s film noir. Why do that? To show us exactly how mass media actively distorts our sense of reality. He zooms in on a typewriter's X key at the end of a typed statement, a statement that police conveniently interpreted as a full confession. It highlights how textual evidence and media don't automatically provide a passage to the truth. They often just lock us further into our own subjective narratives. Section 3. McNamara and Self-Deception, the Ultimate Barrier to Truth. Scaling things up to the absolute highest stakes of human history, let's turn to former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in the Academy Award-winning film The Fog of War. This specific quote really anchors our understanding of how even a hyper-rational man constructs internal narratives to cope with incredibly destructive events, like the Vietnam War and the firebombing of Tokyo. McNamara admits that human reason has limits, using this concept of the fog of war to explain how horrific decisions get made. It's a striking look at how a brilliant, highly statistical mind tries to reconcile its role in a historical tragedy by pointing to the sheer incomprehensibility of the world. So, how do historians cut through all of that to piece together historical reality, like what really happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, because human memory is so incredibly flawed, a structured method was required. Historians developed what's called critical oral history. Basically, you take the subjective memories of officials like McNamara, but you force those memories to collide head-on with declassified documents and strict, objective scholarly analysis. It's a rigorous way to pierce right through those self-serving narratives people naturally build up. Visually, Morris represents this fog of human nature in a really fascinating way, showing us McNamara's very distant statistical perspective on warfare. Rather than showing the horrific, on-the-ground human reality of the Tokyo firebombing, we see blue numbers literally raining down like bombs onto a map. It perfectly reflects how McNamara, a statistician at his core, viewed the mission's success. Or take the giant map with dominoes tumbling down all the way to Saigon. It illustrates the abstract, heavily criticized Cold War theory that drove the U.S. into Vietnam. These images capture exactly how his mind operated. Section 4. The Fog of Obfuscation, the Era of Donald Rumsfeld. Next up, we impartially examine Donald Rumsfeld in the documentary The Unknown Known. Built around his obsessive habit of pumping out endless memos, we see how a highly polished, affable veneer can create an absolutely impenetrable cloud of obfuscation, avoiding the uncomfortable realities of the Iraq War. While McNamara leaned into the fog of war, Rumsfeld built a literal fortress out of language. By dissecting his famous phrases like known unknowns and unknown unknowns, the film shows how Rumsfeld used articulate, confident wordplay to insulate himself from the contradictions or absurdities of his very own statements. Comparing these two gives us a look at wildly different methods of self-deception, employed by powerful men facing down historical tragedies. Critics analyzing the films noted that McNamara offered what they called alligator tears, essentially a self-righteousness posing as self-criticism so he could pass his ultimate moral exam. Rumsfeld, on the other hand, exhibited this almost clinical euphoria. It was a cheerful, unruffled statesmanship that never allowed a single crack in his veneer. Two different men, two entirely different strategies for maintaining their subjective reality when confronted with objective historical destruction. Section 5. Trapped in Plato's Cave, the Anatomy of Self-Deception. To fully grasp why truth remains so elusive, we have to look at the documentary Mr. Death. It follows an unlicensed engineer turned Holocaust denier named Fred Loiter. This psychological extreme shows us that individuals will completely blind themselves to reality, inventing their own strange ideologies simply to cure their inner loneliness. The film explores how Loiter, a nerdy, previously ignored guy, found an audience that finally praised him. And in exchange for that adoration, he actively eroded historical reality. It perfectly demonstrates what philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. It's a terrifying look at exactly what the human mind is willing to sacrifice just to feel important. We deceive ourselves to cope with reality. It's much like the prisoners in Plato's cave, who prefer the absolute safety of their subjective shadows over the harsh light of objective history. In that classic allegory, if a prisoner is dragged out of the cave and shown the real world, the light is so blinding, so traumatic, that they'll run right back into the darkness. Morris's work suggests that we are all to some degree those prisoners. We construct our shadows, whether that's an obsession with a detective movie, the statistical logic of falling dominoes, or just a desperate need for approval, because dealing with the unvarnished world directly is just way too traumatic for us. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. Challenge your own subjective lenses, because the truth might be hiding just outside your cave. If powerful men who hold the fate of the world in their hands and everyday witnesses walking down the street are all so easily blinded by their own internal narratives and media consumption, how certain can you really be of your own reality? The objective truth is out there, for sure, but capturing it requires stepping out of the dark, looking past the reflections of our own desires, and finally opening our eyes. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.